And Nicola Kleyn, when crisis strikes, 10 rules to survive and avoid a reputation disaster, is the latest handbook on disaster management to hit the market. The book provides practical guidelines to help businesses and organizations deal better with their scandals, especially now that we're living in the digital and social media age. But to talk more about this, let's speak to the book's co-author, Professor Nicola Kleyn, and she joins us now via Skype. Professor, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Morning, Zimpiwe. Good to be here.
It's an absolute pleasure. Let's start with how this project by yourself and Francis Hurd came to being. I mean, how was that the first conversation like?
I had met Francis when she was studying at the Gordon Institute of Business Science. She did research into how journalists form relationships with CEOs. And she contacted me a year or so later and said to me, I cannot get over how poorly so many of our corporates are handling the crises that we're facing. I think we should write a book. And I said to her, Francis, I'm a dean. I'm busy. I don't think I can write a book. And she came back and she said, but I want to write a book with you and we need to write this book. So the book had nothing to do with COVID-19. It was really generated out of observations around poor crisis management and communication. And that's how it started. We kicked off writing in about October last year, publishing with Pan Macmillan. And of course, just as COVID-19 was hitting, we were wrapping up the book. So we put in a postscript chapter on that. But it really is focused on organizations who have to navigate crisis, which I guess is all of us today.
Well, I suppose then that Francis' persistence paid off. Now we get to indulge ourselves in this kind of offering. And more than ever, Professor, companies are being called out on public domains with the help of social media, of course, arguably one of the tools that can be used to damage their reputation, isn't it?
Absolutely. You cannot hide anymore. And so the question is not, is a crisis going to strike? And is my name going to be in the media? The question is, how am I going to conduct my affairs as a CEO? How is this company going to behave when we start getting these complaints and these accusations of wrongdoing? And that's really what we investigated in the book. You can't expect that your name is not going to be in the media. And as you say, with social media, things spread very quickly. Things move very quickly.
Right. And over the years, we've seen so many scandals that have rocked corporate South Africa. Do take us through some of those that have managed to get it right. And of course, those that have completely missed the mark.
Simpiwe, thanks for asking that, because the way we've structured the book is we actually pulled it into 10 key rules around crisis management. I'm not crazy about rules, but I think you have to understand them before you break them. Sure. And to anchor each rule, we actually looked at the behavior of organizations. And so I suppose our largest collective crisis that we faced prior to COVID-19 really was state capture. And we spent quite a bit of time looking at a number of the multinationals that were implicated in state capture. So there's a focus on organizations that we really felt didn't get it right, like KPMG. We also have focused on a crisis of public harm, and that, of course, was the Tiger Brands crisis. And we compare and contrast what we see as the very poor handling of that crisis to other organizations, particularly one in the United States, that actually did much better because they acknowledged the crisis, they publicly apologized, and they saw a strong recovery and growing trust in their organization. We've also focused on companies that do both, because companies don't always get it right. So the one company that comes up in the book as being a company that was slow to respond in one case, and I take you back to the case of Frankie's and a baby carrier incident a year or two ago, was Woolies. But at the same time, when you look at Woolies' conduct in the Tiger Brands case, it was far more responsive, much quicker to acknowledge the crisis. So we've tried to focus on organizations, we've focused on a school, we've focused on how to handle apologies in the text. And then also we look at the importance of managing relationships across stakeholders. And one of the organizations that we focus on there is South African Airways, which we feel has not handled stakeholders well. I'm not talking about the business rescue process here, but in terms of building strong relationships with employees and unions, wasn't done as well as it should have been.
You know, Professor, we know that there is a confluence of two or more events that normally strike at the same time and, hit companies and organizations when they least expect it. I mean, Now we are hit by the COVID-19 crisis, which us and the rest of the world had no idea of, had no clue of, and we least expected it. And this comes at a time when South Africa is literally in a technical recession, and the growth is not looking so good. And we know that there are different levels of crises, and some rules may not necessarily apply. But which of the 10 rules that you've outlined in this book do you think are the most important?
So, Simpiwe, you make a very good point that this initial crisis is certainly not a crisis of any company's making. It's not like a product harm where they are culpable. And sometimes that makes crises easier. It can mean you don't have to come out and apologize, for example. But certainly what this crisis means for all of us is that there are key rules that are applicable. The rule that we start off with, that is the critical rule, is to minimize harm. Now, in the case of a crisis like this, companies are going to be faced with very difficult choices around how to operate, about when to close up shop. We're seeing already cases of retailers, of factories having to close because of COVID-19 cases. Yeah. And that is as it should be. I mean, nobody wants to do this. But if we start looking at the first rule of crisis management, you have to try and protect human lives. You have to minimize environmental harm. Now, that becomes very difficult because when you're sitting in a situation where by staying open, you are obviously looking after your own financial sustainability, it's a tough trade-off. But that would be my first rule, is the question of minimizing harm in a public health crisis, I think is self-evident, and trying to promote safe behavior. The other thing that I think is really important in any crisis is the assumption that you can just carry on and not communicate with anybody. Right. So while we navigate this crisis, and as boards of directors are sitting around tables trying to figure out what to do with their companies and how to respond, particularly for their employees, it's an incredibly stressful time. So we have to keep up the communication. And often I think senior executives think that because they don't have anything to say, or because perhaps they don't know what the answers are, they don't talk. And we're at a point where none of us know exactly how this crisis is going to pan out. But what is absolutely essential is that organizations are identifying their key employees and are open to questions and are open to engagement. Even if sometimes the answer is, we don't know exactly what we're doing, but this is how we're tackling things at the moment. We can't make any promises. People are understandably very concerned about retrenchments, around scale backs, around cut downs. The important thing is not to hide. It's to keep on engaging with people. And what will play out, sadly, will play out. But no company should be accused of covering up or delaying their responses.
Okay, Professor, this book is bound to come in handy, especially now that the COVID-19 is in place. And it certainly will be, it is a thought-provoking offering that you've produced. Thank you so much for your time. Much appreciated. Well, joining us there is Professor Nicola Kleyn, and she's speaking to us about a book that she co-wrote with Francis Hurd titled When Crisis Strikes, 10 Rules to Survive and Avoid a Reputation Disaster.